Thank you for coming this afternoon. So we have a fantastic panel here. At the very far left is Elizabeth Corr, who is the manager of art partnership and events at NRDC, Chicago's office, where she's actually been working at NRDC since 2008. And last year, in April, she created the first ever Artist in Residence program involving Jenny Kendler, who's sitting here. The artist is soared downstairs with a beautiful performance event that we're going to discuss together today. And here is Rebecca Riley, who is a senior attorney at the NRDC. And she will be very useful to explain to us all the problematics, all the economic factors, as well as numbers, figures, what is going on out there in the world. Now, Rebecca has been involved prior to NRDC with the US Department of Justice in the Environmental and Natural Resources Division. And then we have Jenny Kendler, our fantastic artist, of course, interdisciplinary artist, environmental activist, naturalist, wild forager, and social entrepreneur. There is plenty there. Now, as I said earlier, she's the first artist in residence at NRDC, and her sculptures and project have an interactive quality that is particularly important to Jenny. We're going to discuss this today as well. Now, she's involved in quite a few organizations too. So, for instance, the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, the Koke Biennale has been exhibiting her work. Exit Art and Gallery 400 has also been one of the institutions that have been exhibiting Jenny's work. She stewards two arts nonprofits as vice president of Artists Residency Acre. So again, where do you find the time, Jenny, for that? And she's also a member of Three Walls Community Cabinets. She's also a co-founder of the popular artist website, Other People's Pixels, and co-founder of the Endangered Species Print Project, which has thus far raised over $13,000 for critically endangered species. So that's a pretty interesting panel here. Yes. That's gone. Now, most importantly, I just wanted to start with Rebecca and ask Rebecca if you could give us a bit of a background about the situation. We all know that Jenny's project aims to raise awareness of the plight that's now affecting monarch butterflies, and Rebecca is the best person to talk to when it comes to the facts of what's going on right now.
So about 20 years ago, 1 billion monarch butterflies made the journey down to Mexico, where they go every single year. This year, only about 56 million butterflies made that journey, which is the second lowest on record. So what we know is we've had a really serious decline in the population. And it turns out the Midwest is a really important factor that's causing that decline, because the monarch butterfly relies on a plant called milkweed, and that's where it lays its eggs, and the caterpillar eats that before it enters the cocoon and becomes a butterfly. So over the years, we've started spraying our crops with something called Roundup. It's a pesticide that's designed to kill weeds, and one of the weeds it kills is milkweed. And so as we've sprayed Roundup everywhere on our crops, on our gardens, we've killed the milkweed that the monarch butterfly really relies on. So what Jenny's project is about is trying to get milkweed back out in our habitats, getting it in our gardens, taking action as a person to try and do something to halt the decline, because actually the monarch is a really resilient species. So if we get milkweed out there, we really think we can make a difference and get the population numbers back up.
Do you want to say something, Jenny?
Well, I was just going to say that there's also been a really exciting win for the NRDC team recently regarding getting milkweed planted on a large stretch of, is it the Illinois tollway? And it's 200, 300 miles of tollway. And Rebecca may not say this herself, but she's really largely responsible for this pretty incredible thing that has happened in the state of Illinois. And so this is just a small a small part of the puzzle, but really shows how individual people's action can make actually a tremendous, tremendous difference here. So, yeah.
Just wanted to ask Elizabeth about, of course, the involvement of NRDC with art, and also the idea of the program that you came up with.
So for those people who don't know, NRDC is a 45-year-old environmental advocacy organization. Rebecca and I work with almost 500 of the smartest and most talented lawyers and scientists and advocates who are working on environmental issues. And it's really wonderful to have such a great team, but what we don't have on staff are people with the kind of talents that Jenny has. Someone who can really take the complicated and technical information that NRDC is producing and animate it and transform it into imagery that really allows people to connect to the issues that we're working on in an emotive way. So that was really the impetus behind starting an Artist in Residence program at NRDC, was trying to find ways to support artists like Jenny who want to make work about the environment, but perhaps don't have access to talk to the top scientists and lawyers in the field. So last April, as Jenny mentioned, we started this program, and we've been doing it for a year now, and the responses have been really amazing. I think seeing people connect to environmental issues on their own terms and through the vector of visual art has been really important, and it's changed the way we at NRDC sort of think about how we can be deploying our resources as an institution as well.
Yeah, I think you guys will see, we just have slides going randomly in the background, but this is only one of the projects that we've put together, and you'll see images from a number of other ones which have focused on issues such as endangered birds, our threatened prairies, native seed distribution, again creating other sources of both food and food plants for monarch butterflies and other endangered and threatened pollinators such as bees. So we're really trying to create a wide spectrum of really different ways in which people can engage with these issues on an emotional level, and maybe take a small action to either help combat the problem, learn something new about it, and just finding different ways to tell people that this is something that they are part of, that we're not disconnected from the natural environment, but rather that we are kind of knitted up intricately into this whole cloth.
Great, and I also wanted to let everyone know that questions are open at any time, so if you want to contribute thoughts, most of you were downstairs as well and still have balloons in the room, which is great, don't pop them in here. The point is that you have to take them to your garden, right? Just making sure. And yeah, do you have any questions? Is there anything you want to ask Jenny or Elizabeth, Rebecca, or myself?
Well, I don't want to kill the caterpillars that are on the milkweed. Do they feed on the leaf?
Yeah, they absolutely do. So the milkweed is actually, it's not just one plant. What we're giving you in the balloons is just one species that's called Asclepia syriaca, also known as the common milkweed. But milkweed itself is actually a genera or group of over 140 different plants. I think maybe 15 or 20 of which are native to this region of the country. And all of those plants can be food for the monarch butterfly. So monarchs themselves as adults can drink nectar from many, many different types of native plants, but the caterpillars can only eat and survive on the leaf of this particular type of plant. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
And that's what they, when the monarchs are flying around looking for a place to plant their eggs, they're looking for milkweed. So if you've wiped it out, they'll keep flying until they become exhausted. And so that's how you can lose a lot of the butterflies. So we really need to get it planted, and we have to get it planted across a wide area where they migrate.
And does a caterpillar feed on the sap of the milkweed? The milkweed has a white sap that comes out of it.
I don't think they're not eating that in particular, but because it's inside of the leaf and part of the leaf, they are ingesting that when they ingest the leaf. Yeah.
Could the panel talk about the aesthetics of milkweed and weeds in general,
That's a really great question. First off, yeah, I think that the word weed is something that we really need to question. What does it mean to call something a weed? That's a human designation that says that these are plants that don't grow where we want them to grow. But do we get to, should we be the arbiters of choice in terms of, the way that we balance natural systems? My husband has actually heard me rail a lot of times on the concept of the weed. His parents have a tree in their yard that they call the weed tree. I was like, what kind of a tree is a weed tree? Every tree is really special, right? But I mean, a weed does have a technical designation. It tends to mean plants that grow in disturbed soils. It tends to mean plants that grow really quickly. But to me, what that says is that these are plants that are tenacious, they're opportunistic, they will grow in areas where human beings have disturbed the soil, such as in agricultural areas, which is where, until recently, until glyphosate started to be widely used, we had huge amounts of native plants such as the milkweed growing along the borders of croplands. That was really important to monarchs, and now has been, they're dying out because of glyphosate use. So yeah, and then aesthetically, I think that these plants they're really special and amazing, and it's just about looking more closely. Some people don't like milkweed because of the sap or the fluffy stuff, getting on your clothing. I happen to think it's a particularly beautiful plant. The flowers are really these intricate, 5-petaled forms, and it's actually a delicious edible, although I try to not eat so much of it since the butterflies are relying on it. So, yeah.
We have a question.
Do you have a question, Gary?
So the farmers consider the milkweed to be a pest because it's a weed.
Right.
Well, but they don't consider monarchs to be pests.
No, monarchs, as far as I know, the monarch butterfly isn't a problem for their crops. It's just milkweed, and actually, my understanding is they're not targeting milkweed specifically. They're targeting, weeds generally. And milkweed happens to be such a strong weed that it used to grow in the fields. It would pop up in between the corn, and it turns out the monarch butterfly preferred that milkweed because as it flew over, it could spot it more easily. And so once we've started spraying the field so heavily, we've lost that milkweed that was managing to pop up every year inside of those fields.
Okay, one more question.
Sure.
So milkweed is considered indigenous to the Midwestern prairie.
Yes.
So like if you did a lot of that milkweed planting in, say, the protected Indiana dunes, that would not be considered an invasive or a foreign species.
Right, as long as we're planting native local milkweeds, planting it would be a native plant. Yeah.
How many balloons do you plan on distributing? How many do you think that it would take?
Okay, two different questions. How many will it take? We talked about this the other day. People actually estimate that we need to spend, and this is going to sound staggering, $100 to $200 billion planting milkweed all across the country, especially in the Midwest, if we want to keep the monarch from going extinct. This is well within the scope of what we can do, and actually I think even more importantly, we can regulate glyphosate, which of course now has also been discovered to be a human carcinogen, so there's more than one reason why we want to take this pesticide off of the market. So we can either pay to plant it, we can allow it to come back naturally by not using the pesticide. And then this project, I think so far we've given away probably 500 balloons, which must have tens of thousands of seeds in them. We'd love to do thousands more. We actually have a plan. We've been commissioned by the Albright Knox, which is a museum in Buffalo. We'll be using, of course, a local milkweed species there to do it 5 or 6 more times over the course of the summer. So we're going to keep putting this on until this isn't a problem anymore. I understand this is a drop in the bucket, but what it's really about is getting people to be emotionally engaged in this issue. And when we say $200 billion or 90% of monarchs are gone, that sounds unapproachable, right? Like what can we as individual people do against this really terrible, multinational corporations out of our control? I want to give people something that they can say yes to so that we can all decide that we're going to be part of this fight together, essentially. I still really believe in the power of individual. Trust ourselves on the right side of this fight, that it's going to go a lot better for the monarchs down the road.
Could you talk a little bit about Monsanto is doing some false advertising, correct? They present this pesticide or as if it is healthy for the soil. I mean, they're presenting this as Roundup is not going to bother your land or create a dead zone or kill the butterflies or the milkweed plant. I mean, they sort of advertise it as it's good for your garden. I've seen their ads.
So Monsanto is starting to realize they have a problem. They actually very recently just committed $4 million to plant milkweed. And that's not nearly enough, as you can imagine, especially for a company with profits like Monsanto. But they do know they have a problem because we do know that it's Roundup that's killing off a lot of the milkweed. So they've started to become aware and they've taken small steps, but not nearly enough.
But you can, it's interesting because I know landscapers. I had one talk to me 2 years ago. I had some buckthorn bushes and said, oh, we need to use Roundup to get rid of all the weeds and the buckthorn. And I said, but Roundup is dangerous. Oh no, it's not going to affect any of the species along here. Well, that obviously would be not true. But he was a landscaper that used Roundup all the time. And I've heard that before from landscapers, that Roundup they don't think of as a dangerous source of pesticide.
Yeah, I mean, it's designed to kill plants. It's designed to kill weeds. So, you know, if you apply it to something, it's going to kill it. The probable human carcinogen finding, which was just recently made by the cancer arm of the World Health Organization, is new. People have been looking at this for years, but this is really the first time a major organization has come out and said something like this. And so this is new and this is big. And, you know, EPA will be looking at that and looking at Roundup specifically on human health concerns.
So the information just needs to get out there to the landscapers, it sounds like.
It sounds like it, yeah.
So are you mapping where people release their balloons so you can kind of start to get a sense of how they're spread by your project?
No, but I love that idea. So, I mean, we know what cities we've done it in, but I think that, yeah, something that's definitely tickled me as an artist is this imagined map of, you know, in St. Louis, when all the people go home from the farmer's market, how they will be going home to all of their different neighborhoods and how then each one of those popped balloons becomes itself a little spreading vector for the seeds. I think that's a great idea, though. We should think about how we can make that happen. We'll need funding for an app.
Follow-up question would be, the $200 billion amount, is it take into account, is that based on a 0 to back where it was figure, where if you were to have the funds to plant enough seeds all at once to bring things back to where they were in terms of milkweed supply would cost roughly that amount? But is there an exponentialism to seed distribution where seeds start propagating themselves, and is there a different figure there that just by getting, that might be more approachable? If the exponentialism of seeds reseeding is taken into account, I'm just wondering how those figures were arrived at.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess I should make clear where I got that number from. It was someone who wrote into Scientific American who said that they were a Monarch expert and they were really quoting it off the top of their head. So this is not from, it was not from a official source, but I was really taken aback by that figure. I think you're absolutely right that natural processes will take care of themselves, assuming that we don't continue to poison these plants, that, you know, each individual plant can increase exponentially. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe Rebecca knows more.
Yeah, so what's really important is that you have habitat where milkweed can do that. So you need a place where you're not mowing all the time, obviously, and where you're not spraying. And so one of the things NRDC has looked at is our roadsides, because those are huge acreage where potentially we could plant a lot of prairie plants like milkweed They could grow. We could decrease our maintenance costs because you're not mowing all the time, you're not spraying. And if you got milkweed out there, it would, spread to other parts of the road and continue to grow. And as long as we're treating that land right, you're right, it should be able to spread by itself.
Two questions. The normal cycle of the plant, well, I guess first of all, it's considered a perennial?
Milkweed, I think, is an annual.
Oh, so it
Yeah.
does have to be planted every year.
Well, there are a few of the species, like Asclepias tuberosa, that's a perennial, but they don't grow in this zone of the country. Yeah, so you do need to replant it, but it does, of course, an amazing job of replanting itself, thanks to nature.
So the next question would be, is there some kind of projection on how long you'd have to plant the seeds in order to bring up the population of the monarch? In what span of time might you start seeing that upward climb?
I don't think that we know the answer to that question, but we do know that we have to take action on this soon. If you look at the precipitous decline, this is something that we need to be thinking about now and doing whatever we can. So.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say the good news is the monarch is actually a really resilient species, and so all we need to do is get the milkweed out there and stop poisoning it, and we do think it will rebound if we do that. So, just making sure that gets done is the important part.
And also, I think it's important to remember that the milkweed is being an annual. It means that it matures within the year. So if we were to plant quite an amount of seeds this year, there would be an amazing result this year. It's not a plant that will need 5 years before it starts blooming and then starts seeding itself. So it's actually a more manageable target than other plants. Could be more more slow growing plants would be. Yeah, I think in that respect it's actually quite manageable. You could see an impact within probably a reasonable time frame of 2 to 3 years, because whatever you plant now will actually bloom this summer, and the caterpillars will be able to feed on it right away. So that's why I think the balloons are great right now. They're perfectly in season, and if we all go home today and do our duty, that'll be definitely food for the caterpillars this summer, which is a great prospect. I think some of the issues with engaging with the environment and wondering what can I do to personally save something or change a situation has to do with this lack of really measurement that's within our reach. But in this case, you can just look at your plants in summer in the garden as they flower and then check if the caterpillars are on them. They're very showy. We have a picture actually of the caterpillar coming round on screen, so you won't miss them. They're quite sizey and very beautiful too. If you don't have just questions right now, I wanted to ask something with regards to the aesthetics again, because of course the amazing, there are, if you like, two parts to this amazing project, and one of it, it's the environmental impact, the idea that we will take home these balloons today and something will change, and the other is the aesthetic value, the artistic value of what Jenny is doing. And one of the things I found particularly interesting about the project was this idea of looking at small things, smaller things than we usually are asked to look at when it comes to environmental impact. We tend to think about polar bears, lions, all the charismatic megafauna, as it is called, that captivates our imagination and makes us feel connected to nature in a kind of dramatic way. But then I think there's something interesting going on here, where you're basically taking us to our backyard as a place of wonder. That there's a resource that's at our doorstep. So I wanted to hear a little bit more from Jenny about this.
Yeah, you raise a good point. Some of you may be surprised to learn that our great John Muir, one of the grandfathers of environmentalism, wasn't actually particularly interested in the animals or the plants that lived in the areas. He was interested in protecting these big, sweeping vistas, these huge landscapes. And you make, of course, a good point. There's a kind of tongue-in-cheek comment in environmental circles that people are only interested in protecting the charismatic megafauna, right? So you can sell a calendar with, with an okapi or a lion on the front. But if you put an American burying beetle, which is actually a quite attractive beetle that happens to eat carrion, which makes it not so popular, but is very endangered as well, you sell less calendars. But yeah, I'm trying to get people to look at the small things. Partly this is a intentional gesture on my part, reacting against the fact that we will just value something when it's large, when it's grand. Things that are, especially in the art world, things that are fabricated. That you go to a museum, you never see small paintings. You see, and except in the wonderful show that Laura has curated. One reason I like her curation so much, that in most major museums you're seeing only the hugest of works, often things that are made by other people other than the artist. So part of my work is really a direct reaction to that, trying to say that you can still have an intensity and a gravity to things that are tiny. A lot of my sculptures in the show here you'll see are really the size for one person to look at a time, so that you're having this direct, intimate, bodily, even visceral connection with the work. And that's part of what interests me about the tiny, is that I think that there's something really subversive in the way that little things can get under your skin. And I'm trying to get people, open them up, their sense of wonder, that this is the way that I operate when I'm walking around in the natural world, which my father can certainly attest to. Has mentioned a number of times to me that when I was a little kid, I'd be like, look, Dad, a tiny flower, a little piece of a bird's egg, a miniature shell. There's so much wonder and beauty and pleasure in these things that otherwise go overlooked. And I think that if we can reattune ourselves to this sensuous realm that is really all around us, that this can only be good for us and good for the planet, to reintegrate ourselves into this field and re-enliven our senses, which are so often shut down when it was a perfect example, all the people walking by outside who are they're too busy to listen or to hear anything. And I think, people can think in the city, maybe there's no nature here, that there's nothing to spy or to enjoy, but I don't think that that's true. Firstly, because even here sitting in this room, we're all inside of our animal bodies that are breathing and sweating and made out of hair and sinew and blood. We could not be more animal or more connected to nature, even just sitting where we are. And then of course, the city is full of nature. Everywhere that you go, there are, the classic dandelion growing up through the crack in the sidewalk. But there are also, monarch butterflies flying through, and there's wild coyotes that run the train tracks at night. So, there's this whole connection that I'm trying to, to get people to focus on the details. I think it enriches one's life, but it also has really important conceptual and even political significance. Joan? Oh.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, because I think from my perspective, when you think about the aesthetics of the project, part of what's so moving from my perspective is that the project sort of reminds us of the ephemeral nature of nature, right? We're giving participants something that has a limited lifespan. And, that is a metaphor for the issues that NRDC is working on every day. And so I think that the act of giving someone a balloon and asking them to destroy it, essentially, is a reminder in some way of our actions have consequences, both in good and bad ways. And this is, sort of a positive iteration of that. But again, it points to sort of the ephemeral nature of everything.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to ask you to say a little more about what was written by your statue, your sculptures, the pieces down there about the connection between nature and culture.
Mm-hmm. So again, I think part of what I'm really interested in is creating this reintegration of our, there's a perception that one, like I just mentioned, human beings think that they're not animals. Even if there are people who will argue with you that is not the case. And then there are people, more often who just don't think about it. They just think, oh, well, there's humans and then there are animals. Those are two different things. Whereas I think that clearly, if you look at science, such is not the case. As such, that, like I said, we're inextricably knitted into this cloth of the natural world, and that when we call out culture conceptually, again, politically, as something that's separate from the natural world, that we're sort of snipping the threads of this cloth one by one, and what's going to happen is that it's going to unravel all around us. That our culture is so intimately dependent on the natural world, it would be hubris to think otherwise. So yeah, again, I think that humans are incredibly special animals. We're really, how wonderful it is that we can, you're particularly special, Joan. But how wonderful it is that we can turn back around and look at the natural world and write about it and make art about it and observe it and take pleasure in it. But that doesn't mean that we're separate from it.
And considering I think the idea of looking and seeing is coming back over and over. There's one of the things I find extremely fascinating about Jenny's project is with regards to the fact that it involves children. So I've seen so many children downstairs, and you were so great at telling them what to do with the balloons. I really admire your narrative strategies, and the way of enticing, like you say, the emotional connection is really important. And it's never too early to start, isn't it, when it comes to nature? So, but besides that, the idea of the artistic use of balloons is also interesting. There may have been a few images up there flashing with works of art of other artists who have used balloons, especially during the last century, but even more recently, like a very famous balloon work of art was Piero Manzoni's Artist Breath, where he just blew a balloon to a certain size and then attached it to a plinth. Of course, the balloon deflates and then shrivels and remains almost invisible, returns to a state of invisibility like where it was before it was blown up. And there was also Martin Creed, who filled up half a room with balloons and called it Half a Room Filled with Balloons. And of course, Andy Warhol with balloons flying around the room, again, the pillows that were filled with helium. And I think what's interesting about all these works and Jenny's work and the connection, if you like, of using balloons is that balloons have always been used in art to make things visible. Things that are normally invisible become a quantity that it's measurable. So in this case, I think it's fascinating that we have a sort of invisible problem to a degree in the way that it requires a level of awareness to be triggered. So we've all probably noticed that there's fewer monarchs flying around, but how many fewer? In some areas you might still see quite a few, in some areas there are none. And I think it's very cunning that Jenny decided to use balloons to actually make this statement about visibility and about making something that usually it's fleeting and not really too easy to grasp, kind of quantifiable and visible. It's a very interesting aspect. Do we have any questions about any aspects of the project? Because I have so many questions. I could just go on. I'll go on for a while. You think about your questions. I just wanted to talk to Elizabeth for a short while, because this is obviously a great collaboration. And as I said earlier in the introduction, Elizabeth created the program, and Jenny is the first artist to take place in this program. The partnership, the residency, it's been now going on for a year. And there are certain specific conditions that have been set for this residency. It's not like any other residency, right? I remember we were discussing the idea of the absence of a studio, for instance, which is very important, right? Which sounds like a little draconian, but it works. Did you want to tell us something about the way you've been working with Jenny?
So that is right. The model of this residency is purposefully different than the way residencies currently operate. And the reason for that is because I think there's a void that I was trying to fill in establishing this. And that is, Jenny was working already as an artist who was interested in land and wildlife issues. She was doing that work successfully. She had a studio practice. She was showing all over. What she didn't have was access to people like Rebecca, who are doing the legislative work, the scientific work, in the policy work. And so when thinking about how you can mobilize artists to really become activists on an issue, it just occurred, well, why don't we actually put them in a room together? So instead of a studio space, Jenny has an office space, and she comes to our office. She has 24-hour access. She participates on phone calls, in meetings, and the idea is that there's an artist's voice at the table. So her opinion is just as relevant as other people's opinions, but she may provide different insight as to how we should be tackling certain issues or talking about them. So we, like other residencies, we provide a stipend for the artist. We believe it's really important that they're compensated for the work that they do. We provide money for materials and venues so that we can do public performances. A key component of the residency is public outreach, reaching out to new communities that perhaps NRDC isn't reaching on our own. And I think another big part of it is, again, communicating our messages in different ways. So bringing this element of fantasy, that as a scientific and legal organization, we don't get to communicate in fantasy. We have to work in facts and figures. What Jenny allows us to do is sort of attribute meaning to those facts and figures in different ways and through an artistic perspective. So that's the idea behind the residency.
Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that this has been a really extraordinary experience for me, partly because of Elizabeth's close understanding of the way that artists need to work and to actually be successful in what they do. I've heard a number of other times about creative people working with other activist or advocacy-based organizations, and oftentimes what you end up with is like a really cool puppet that goes to a rally, or like a big whale banner that you throw off the top of a building. And those are wonderful activist projects and are really important, but I feel like in order to walk this line, what we're trying to do, and I hope that you feel that we're succeeding, but I think is relatively ambitious, is to create something that is an advocacy-based project that's also and scientific, that's also an art project, where neither one of those things erase each other. So we don't want the work to become too didactic or too prescriptive. At the same time, it's not just a pure fantasy, that we're really interested in rooting this and connecting to the real world. They've just been really open in the way that I've worked with them. It's basically been an open door to speak with different scientists, to collaborate with different people in the organization, and then to really just make the work that I want to make. So there was never a case of like, hey, you need to design a project around bees or butterflies, or we want you to create this metric translation. I think that's part of why it's been really successful.
I think one last thing, a residence or experience as a resident artist or doing an artist residency is oftentimes isolation is prioritized. So being able to sort of go away and be by yourself to think and get inspired. And this is the complete opposite of that. So Jenny's almost never without someone from NRDC bothering her about something. It's a deeply collaborative process.
Yeah.
From the idea, the seed of an idea, to the actual participation in the project. I'm helping to hand out balloons.
Thank you, by the way.
Yeah. And so I think that sort of is an advantage in a lot of ways, because it's a conversation with multiple voices present. And again, it's sort of a metaphor for how we think we should be talking about the environment. No one environmental group is going to solve all of the issues that we're dealing with. There should be other people at the table, and I want this residency to be a model for doing that.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're interested in is talking about de-siloing. So, much of the progress of the 20th century has been about breaking disciplines into, further and further specialized zones, which has allowed us to be tremendously productive and prolific, although some would argue with our late phase capitalism as being a productive method. But I think that what we're realizing is that that's not enough. We can't just have all of these specialists working in their own isolated disciplines. Looking back at the natural world again as a model, you find that every hyper specialist is connected to every other, right? So a hummingbird that pollinates one particular ginger plant has a specific species of mite that when it pollinates the ginger plant, the mite runs up the bill of the hummingbird and travels from plant to plant in that way. And so I think we need to act that way too. I think it's pretty unusual to have a senior attorney and an artist on a panel together, but here we are. You are my mite. Do you have a question?
So I would like to hear you talk about, did this interaction with the scientists and with NRDC, did it change your work? How did your work change? And I want to hear from Elizabeth about, did this interaction with the first artist, did it change your idea about what you thought this residency was going to do?
Yeah, it's changed my work hugely. I mean, partly initially because having the financial and the institutional support, having a really amazing team of people who are willing to collaborate with me, to give me feedback even from the earliest stages of an idea, all along the way. I mean, I actually think I have to give Elizabeth total credit for the food cart idea that ended up being a really key part of this project. So just in terms of having really smart collaborators, that's made a big difference in my work. And then in terms of also, yes, citing it within this advocacy science-based organization, you know, that has really allowed me to kind of reach out and grasp at something that I've been trying to do for a long time that I think has been extremely challenging, and I don't think I've been successful until just now, which is to be creating things that are works of art, but that also are having a real tangible impact on the world. And I don't think I probably could do that without being nestled in this organization.
So I think a year into this now, I had this idea when we started that that Jenny would be able to help NRDC in ways that we were sort of struggling. And again, that was helping us talk outside to the people who weren't maybe already converted, or didn't already consider themselves environmentalists. But I have to say I've been extremely surprised at this momentum, because I think we started this at a time when this kind of work wasn't happening. And suddenly, you know, Laura Fatemi is curating a show in an arts and cultural institution that is about dirt and soil and the environment. And so I think that there's been some sort of like rustling about how important this stuff is. And once we started to see this happening more and more. So being able to partner with cultural institutions is not something NRDC has done before. So just having the opportunity to do that has been really wonderful. Of course, there's certain specific ways as a science organization that you talk about your work. We issue white papers, we write legal briefs, we do press conferences. It's not always the most interesting way to talk about the environment. And so having other organizations come to us, like arts museums and galleries, and giving us an opportunity to partner with them has really transformed the way that we're able to work as an environmental advocacy organization.
I'm really interested in how the project, all of your work together, serves as a reframing of what milkweed is. And from a legal standpoint, I'm wondering about some of the challenges you may have been thinking forward about regarding, going back to aesthetics again, involving weeds and so quote-unquote community standards in terms of where and how people in their own yards plant what many in a community might consider an unattractive plant, and how you thought about how that could be reframed into something that is actually a beautiful plant or a desirable plant to have, not just in your backyard or in the alley, but in your front yard, for example.
Well, I actually think genuinely is a really beautiful flowering plant. And, we have started planting a lot of milkweed on roadsides. They've been doing this in Iowa for about 3 years now, and there's been no objection because it turns out the prairie is really beautiful. There are lots of different colored flowers, all sorts of tall plants, and so they really haven't run into trouble with that. So we think that if we do that here in Illinois, that we'll have the same good luck.
What, to build on that, what about in people's yards? Because I think that's where some people might have pushback. And that's another great resource in terms of acreage for all of us to be planting more locally and encouraging monarchs. Has that come into the conversation at all? Are you focused on, right now, on public way?
Well, I haven't really encountered it. We actually were lucky enough to tour the City Hall rooftop last summer, and they have a ton of milkweed up there, and we saw a bunch of monarch butterflies flying around. It was really incredibly cool. And the flowering plants were beautiful, and we just haven't run into that, I don't think.
I think that it's less people being opposed to planting it in their yards. I think a lot of people don't realize that you can have a flowering weed that's actually really beautiful. When you think about weeds, you don't often think of big, purple, beautiful flowers. There's some images scrolling behind us. And again, that's part of what this project is trying to do. So not just pop balloons, but teach people how to identify milkweed and hopefully get them to want to mobilize themselves in their community and neighborhood to plant it in their own yards as well.
Yeah, but I think what you're alluding to is that maybe we need a little bit of a cultural reset here. So yeah, that why everyone is saying this is a beautiful plant, but I think you're right. Some people still don't see that. They hear the word weed. It's not a petunia. It didn't come from Home Depot. It makes its own seeds. Ooh, that's worrisome. So I think, and it doesn't grow in a neat little compact bush necessarily, right? So yeah, I think we need to reset people. We need to get them tuned back into their senses, and to just see, oh, this is actually a really beautiful plant. I can grow this in my yard. And then it has this conceptual beauty too, that you're supporting butterfly populations.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too that you were bringing up, because rethinking how we do our lawns in our yards. Because, I think that's a huge problem in this country, where it's just a green lawn and a few shrubs around the side. And, can we have more wild gardens?
Right. Yeah, lawn is really a completely perverse concept. That there's this, we plant one species of plant all across it, we don't let any other ones grow, and then we chop its head off, every week. It's just...
Or poison.
Yeah.
There's certain flower shops for milkweed.
I'm a community gardener.
Uh-huh.
I know people have fits, but I actually grow dandelion for the dandelion green.
Great.
But I cut the flower seed out and just gather the green. And the reason I do it, when I was tiny, I used to see these ladies in the parkways with aprons. And I was wondering, what are they doing? And someone told me they were Italian ladies from that community gathering dandelion greens.
Yep.
At that time, of course, they didn't know about pesticides. That's why in my community garden, I grow dandelions, because I don't use pesticides.
Yeah. And that's exactly the type of cultural reset that I'm talking about. We actually have had this knowledge and had this connection to nature and all of this wonderful knowledge about plants, and we forgot it. But not everyone has forgotten. Your wonderful Italian ladies who are picking dandelion greens, and their aprons are a great example. And there are actually a lot of communities in Chicago, especially immigrant communities, who still forage. I lead wild foraging workshops. And that's another really important way that I think that we can get back in touch with the natural world. Why just touch when you can taste?
I think you bring up a really good point, both of you, and that's our sort of desire to manage and maybe overmanage nature, to sort of like strip it of its wildness, right? And we do that in our lawns and in our gardens. And I think this is something that Jenny's work communicates so beautifully is this sort of rewilding of places and things and animals that we've sort of stripped of most of their natural meaning. So I think management is a big issue here as well.
Oh, and by the way, this was years ago. I had my own house, my own garden in the front. And a lady came by and she knocked on my door and she said, you know, I have to give you a citation because of what you're growing here. And then I explained to her that I grow because of you. This is before I knew about milkweeds and dandelions and so on. And she listened to me and said, she was hired by the city of Chicago. She was a safety guard on the streets. And for the summer, she was hired to walk around in different communities and give out citations for weeds. So, and I talked to her and told her about it. Oh, she said, that's okay, don't worry.
Sure. So the technology of Monsanto kind of has been the enemy here. Is there a chance that technology could also help? So how does Roundup work biologically? And how difficult would it be to develop a form of milkweed that would be resistant to excrement? So your balloons could include seeds that wouldn't be susceptible to herbicide.
So I think you're suggesting a Roundup-ready milkweed? I would in general be opposed to that idea, partly because, again, we're finding out that Roundup is a human carcinogen. This is what we were saying before, that glyphosate, the chemical that Roundup has recently been found. I guess it was just a few weeks ago to be a human carcinogen. So these plants that have been genetically altered to be desensitized to Roundup basically then become an excuse to apply high amounts of Roundup. So in theory, yes, that would allow milkweed as one single plant to be resistant. It's extremely expensive to develop a genetically engineered plant in that way. I'm not sure that that's the right solution. I also don't mean to demonize technology in any way. I just, I think that when we're using technology, we need to think about its larger impacts. And I guess my most sincere hope would be that Monsanto would, that they would see that they can be more ecologically friendly. I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with GMO technology, for example, but I do think that the way that we're utilizing it in general is pretty short-sighted and not very well tested.
Technology, I think, is interesting for this issue in another way, in that it's allowing us to actually track monarchs in really cool ways and know exactly where they are and when they're turning around and coming back from Canada and going to Mexico. And those sorts of developments in technology are another sort of open door that allow people to understand the importance of them, where they are, and it's really sort of bringing science, to your iPhone in a way that is informative and educational, and hopefully will mobilize people to really care about the issue.
Yeah, you were telling us about the Monarch tracking, right?
Yeah, the way people are tracking their own sightings, and then they put them on a little map, and so you can see the movement of the monarchs from Mexico up through Texas. It's really cool.
I was wondering if you guys knew about any, I don't know, I was watching a show at some point about monarchs and talking about their travels from Mexico to Canada and back, and they talked about how in either going there or coming back, there are like 3 different generations of monarchs, but then on our way back, there's like one generation of monarch that is like a super monarch, like literally make it all the way back without like dying. And I'm wondering if there's like genetic research or any like interesting science that's being done figuring out why that is, or if that's even true. Or... You guys know it?
I can take that by saying my understanding is, and I may not know everything that there is to know about this, but my understanding is that we don't know. It's actually a real mystery to us how the monarchs do this. So that there are monarch generations that hatch, say, in, you know, as far north as Alberta or in the Midwest, and they're traveling in this beeline, to use maybe a not quite apt metaphor, towards this small region of cool montane forests in Michoacan. We don't know how they do it. That there's this, you're right, that there's this successive generations. So one generation maybe only makes it 500 miles and then gives rise to the next generation. We don't yet understand this, and you know, one more reason to not destroy it, because it's so wondrous. I mean, you know, that us with all of our technology and all of our science can't figure out how a little butterfly gets from here to there. So, I mean, I think I would be really curious to know the answer as well. But yeah, my understanding is we don't know.
There's also something interesting, I think, that we've been touching upon, the idea of the space and like resetting our sort of conception of spaces as well as what goes into a certain space. And I was thinking more about the garden as a political space in this case, and the idea of ownership, because obviously we all own our gardens. We pay for them when we buy our properties or when we rent. But the question I think that your project brings on the map is like, who really owns it in terms of responsibility, in terms of thinking about the garden as a living space that it's shared with a network of creatures and plants that also live there, whether we like it or not. There's this sort of transient aspect whereby you can never really shut out of your garden all the animals or all the plants. There's always this continuous flux of life that comes in and out of your garden. So your garden becomes a little bit less yours every time it's shared by these creatures. And I'm thinking about the political aspect that I favor here is this idea of you bringing milkweed, which, as we said, it's a weed, and the competition there that it might pose to petunias and other plants that are very pretty, but that are pretty useless as well to the animals that come into the, and how actually there's a connection with Home Depot, as you mentioned. So there's actually multinational organizations making tons of money of these plants, out of these plants that we all have been sort of trained to love over time and to culturally recognize as what we want and what we like to see in our gardens, but that ultimately are probably not the best choice for us and the animals that share our lives and our gardens with us.
Well, if you're suggesting that we should start a campaign to get Home Depot to sell milkweed plants, I think that's a great idea. Yeah, because, right, I mean, people, if you see a beautiful flowering plant and it says bonus, helps butterflies, why would you not?
Yeah.
$3.99, put it in your garden.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I mean, of course, there's, yeah, okay, we'll subsidize it. You know, there's the oldie but goodie, right? That like the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth. So of course we're, you know, we say that we own these different pieces of land, but we're just renting them.
Yes, that's very
Actually, that's a pretty good idea, because somebody would make a lot of money if, you know, started a milkweed farm with seeds.
All right, so the day after we'll talk about it.
That's what they do with the butterfly bush. That's how they promote it.
Yeah.
Right, it's for butterflies.
Yes. I think it'd be a matter of choosing a broader range. But you're right, it's already out there, isn't it? When you go into Home Depot, some plants do say, butterflies love this one.
I think you're bringing up a good point, though, because it's not just the monarch butterfly that's endangered. It's a loss of pollinator-friendly habitat writ large that's really a problem. So this is one component of the problem. But you're right, having plants that will support bees, butterflies, bats, hummingbirds, there does have to be some kind of change at a systemic level to make those choices actual choices for people when you go to the store. I think that's important.
I'd actually love it, Rebecca. Would you tell us a little bit about the work that NRDC does on bees in particular?
Sure. So as many of you probably know, bees are also really in trouble. And it turns out it's also because of a class of pesticides. These are called the neonicotinoids, and they actually treat the seeds before they even start growing, and then the plant starts to grow and continues to produce its own pesticides. So it's a really crazy sort of thing. And originally we thought this would be safer for human health because, you know, you're not spraying pesticides all the time. It's part of the plant. But what it turns out is it's killing the bees, because when they come to get the pollen, they're exposed to it. It weakens their immune system, and it's causing huge problems. So getting neonicotinoids out of our plants is really important. So NRDC is fighting to do that.
Are you talking about a large-scale agriculture or for home use?
Both.
Both.
They are used on crops that we plant, but they're actually even more troubling on lots of plants that if you go to Home Depot to buy something, you can see the label. They're starting to label it more. And if you look at it, they often say, this has been treated with neonicotinoids. And ever since they started labeling, it's actually really surprised me how many of those plants that you're buying there have been treated.
Yeah, and you can see how complex the situation is. You know, I'm not trying to just villainize corporations outright. Neonicotinoids, if you can break down the Latin, it means new nicotinoids. I believe that it's a derivation of a natural insecticide that's produced by tobacco plants, which they themselves are very resistant to insects. So, you know, there were attempts to design friendlier pesticides. I would say that our the pre-testing system has been woefully underwhelming. I don't know, that we're not testing things enough before they come to market. So that's really in contrast. We've talked about this before, to the way that Europe tends to manage new chemicals, that they have to be tested and approved before they can come to market. We have kind of the opposite system here, that everyone, the pesticides or household chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. Good with people, but not so good with chemicals, where they really should be guilty until they're proven to be relatively harmless.
So I actually also happen to be a pharmacist. So the comparison that always comes to mind for me is how, I know it's random, is how strictly we regulate our drugs. And we go through round after round of testing before we put them on the market, and you have to prove that it's safe and effective. And we don't require anything of that level of our pesticides. And what really happens is we approve them, and then the studies come out, and then we're fighting to pull them back off the market after they've already caused harm.
So we were also discussing the project itself, the idea of the cart, and I'm wondering how long Jenny's planning to push the cart around the world to solve all environmental issues that need solving.
Yeah, I think, like I said, we're going to keep doing this project until, as long as art and science organizations, farmers markets want to host us. But yeah, as long as this continues to be an issue, I think that, hopefully this has been capturing people's hearts and minds.
Mm-hmm. There's also a way I like to think about the balloons that we're taking home today is this idea of responsibility. There's like a balloon of responsibility, in the way that it's so difficult sometimes to think, what can I do? It seems always like you're so disempowered by these big corporations that can really call the shots on everything, our health, our money, our lives. But it really, the balloon really captures this it's a concept in itself, the idea that you hold it as well, and you will take it home, and you will take this initiative to actually make a small step in your garden that might actually change things on a broader scale. So it's really charged up with a positivity, and also a lot of, there's something tangible in it that I think it's really strong.
So yeah, we have about 5 minutes.
You have a question over there?
You talked earlier about this being like a small drop in the bucket to help everything, and you can have hope, and that this will do something. But where will you get answers, or is there a way to get answers on how your project has impacted the growth and the monarch butterfly?
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I've thought of that, how can I gather metrics? I guess essentially we've been looking at averages, right? So how many people on average are we reaching? How many of those seeds on average are germinating? So I guess we'll do this project a few more times and then maybe sit down and try to do the math. But like I said, that I think even more than the physical impact of planting the milkweed, we're really, what I hope makes an even bigger impact is that each of you guys today leaves being like part of this fight. So someone who is willing to sign petitions and, you know, talk to their legislators and tell other people about this so that this becomes a growing, spreading movement. That's how cultural change happens, one person at a time. And I think that that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and I guess a follow-up with that would be, I think I read it on the website regarding this project. It was mentioned above that, you know, if someone else is interested in like helping with this, or like having their own type of project, how would you want that to be structured? And where would people get the seeds to like, you know, actually be doing what you're doing?
Yeah, so we had talked about this becoming an open source project, essentially. So meaning that I don't consider this like a copyrighted or proprietary idea in any way. I would love people to take this concept and run with it. And I've been bantering back and forth with a Girl Scout troop, with a couple different teachers. There's a woman who's a library studies major who wants to turn this into a lesson plan. And so I'm really keen to have people take this idea and develop it in any way that they would like. But if they wanted to do a, you know, high fidelity iteration of the project with the balloons and the milkweed seed, I'd be happy to share the instructions with them on how to do it. I think that the very best way to get the milkweed seed is to just collect it in the fall. But there are a number, you know, you can go to different greenhouses or other places that will keep it. Although a point of reference, if you want to actually try to do it, is that it's very hard to find it with the fluff still attached unless you collect it yourself, because the greenhouses tend to clean it unless you tell them ahead of time that you want them to save it for you. But it's easy to replicate. I mean, do it have a milkweed party. We'll serve dandelion greens. So yeah, are there any other questions?
There's one in the back, yes.
I was wondering if you guys have a picture, if you can imagine how big agriculture would function without herbicides, or, you know, what would the impact of, is that what I mean, the idea isn't to replace glyphosate with something else, or is it to let all the weeds, and how does that impact like the labor on the farms? I'm just wondering, like, what does big ag look like without herbicides?
That's a great question. I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that. I wish that my sister-in-law was sitting here with me right now. She's an organic farmer, and I think she would have a lot of really great solutions about how big ag can become more like what she does. I actually think that probably fundamentally the system of growing huge genetically altered monocrops with massive applications of pesticides is not good for human health. It's not good for soil health. And it's certainly not good for pollinators like monarchs and bees. So I think that the whole system needs fundamentally to change. I do believe we can still feed people. I mean, we can start getting really political here. I think one thing that people can do is to eat less meat, actually. That may not seem like an obvious connection, but so much of our GMO soy and corn is going to animals that are in factory farm or feedlot settings. That's a key component to being able to have a sustainable farming culture, is that we will not need to grow so much grain if we are not eating so much meat as a country. But I think that, you know, this is going to be small steps forward. I think that it's absolutely possible, but we have to have the political will to make these changes.
I hope all of you do come on April 21st, because that is what Wes Jackson from the Land Institute is a researcher in that area, and is looking at large-scale farming, but in a sustainable way. So we'll be talking about that.
Oh, excellent. I'm so glad that someone can specifically address that. Great. Perfect segue. Please come to that panel.
And there's an event on our Facebook page. Yeah, you can check our website out. I want to, if you'd all help me give a hand to our speakers.